when you driver's test, you drive around a parking lot on some road with lines on it, and the biggest thing people worry about failing is parallel parking, which most people, unless you live in a certain city or an area where there's apartment, you never use it for the rest of your life. I mean, so that's I had the place, I figured out the exact place to do the road test, because I live over, just a few miles over in New Milford, but if you go to Bergenfield, you can drive through Bergenfield, do the entire length of the town, and go through the Aldi's parking lot down in Foster Village and make it back to the other end. You deserve your license, you really deserve, just make it through the Aldi's parking lot over there, you deserve it. You can see all the cars in the no parking zone and people cutting through, yeah, okay.
You know, it's so bad though that I feel bad for people is that they don't have it. They don't have people that will translate. They have signs. So like you'll be in the car and people will fail for not putting their seatbelt on because they don't know.
Yeah, they fail you for the silly things that you're driving it. It's awful. I'll fix it all. I can fix it all. We'll do that. I'll also do away with power steering. We didn't have it when I got my license. No power steering in the car. You couldn't flip them around. You had to actually drive. And I would make them. I would get rid of automatic transmissions. So you'd all have to use a stick shift. And this way you can't be on the phone texting at the same time that you're trying to shift your car or stuck on a hill. I mean, you drive stuff in the middle. You don't want it to roll back down a hill, a big heavy thing. It's tough to hold it there with a stick shift. So anyhow, that said, that's my comments for the day, dealing with that. Oh, I don't need these notes or these notes in here. We got it. It's in the bag. We're going to just continue our journey through the digestive system. Last time we picked up everything at the salivary glands, the tongue, and the teeth, the accessory structures that were in the oral cavity. And we discussed the 3 salivary glands, the gland names, the ducts, where they empty, what saliva is, what saliva does, the 5 functions. We took a look at the tongue. We discussed the teeth, the different, get this down so it doesn't feedback. The different dentitions that we have, the primary or the baby teeth, the deciduous teeth versus the secondary or permanent dentition, the adult dentition. Took a look at the tooth, the different parts of the tooth, components of the tooth. Then we also took a look at what's going on from the point of view of digestion in the mouth, mastication, chewing, and we initiate carbohydrate digestion. And then we looked at the process of deglutition, swallowing, the 3 different phases, talked a bit about the esophagus, and we finished up talking about achalation and GERD, 2 conditions that you may see, depending on the healthcare field that you go into, you might see them. So that takes us into the stomach at that point, so the next part of this. And if we take a look at the stomach, we're basically looking at something that's really a J-shaped sac. It's capable of quite a bit of distension. Just think about your Thanksgiving dinner, how much you could put in your stomach, or if you do ever watch a little television and you catch the shows like Man vs. Food, where they'll eat like a 13-pound burrito. I don't know how they do it or something. They're able to do it, so it can stretch quite a bit. So we come down the esophagus, we come into the stomach, and we have sort of this J-shaped sac that we have here. There are different areas to the stomach, and we'll talk a little bit about them. First off, at the bottom of the esophagus, where it meets the stomach, we've already talked about it. I'm just going to put an abbreviation again, the LES, the lower esophageal sphincter. At the bottom of the esophagus is the lower esophageal sphincter. It leads into a small area. I'll just put letter A over here. And letter A is something that's called the cardiac of the stomach. That's where the old name for that sphincter, the old name, we called it the cardiac sphincter, not the lower esophageal sphincter. Then there's another area off and to the side over here, letter B. That's the fundus, sort of a storage area for the food before it really gets digested. The main portion of the stomach is the body area. And then finally, the terminal portion of the stomach. I'm just going to use one name. There's different parts to it, but we're just going to stick with the term the pylorus. And so we have these different regions, the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus, these 4 different regions. We also have a large curve on the one side. There's a big curve out here, and it's just simply referred to as a greater curvature. And then there's a little smaller one on the opposite side. Up in here, there's a little curvature up in here, and that one's referred to just as the lesser curvature. And I have it in the picture above us, above my shiny bald head that you can't see the board with the whiteboard there. You can see the different areas associated associated with the stomach in this picture. So we come down the esophagus, we come to the little cardia, there's the fundus, the main part is the body over here, and then we go into the pylorus. I'm calling this all the pylorus. It is made up of something called the pyloric antrum with the A, the first one, the pyloric canal with the C, the second one, and then the pylorus is in this area, but we're just gonna call the whole area the pylorus. And then at the terminal portion over here, there's another sphincter that we have over here, and this is something that's referred to as the pyloric sphincter. As a matter of fact, I believe there's a question on the review sheet that wants to know what is the name of the sphincter that controls or regulates the emptying of the stomach into the small intestine. The answer is the pyloric sphincter. It's going to regulate how fast the stomach empties. So again, the different basic parts of the stomach. The cardia, the fundus, the body, the pylorus, greater curvature on the one side, lesser curvature on the other side with a pyloric sphincter. The picture above me is much better than I draw. I'm a horrible medical illustrator, obviously, but anyhow, you get the all these pictures, people ask me, they're all in the textbook, so if you have chosen to purchase the textbook, all of the pictures are in the textbook. Now the stomach is going to be working different, obviously, than the oral cavity and then the esophagus, so we're going to see some modifications histologically in the stomach that we don't have elsewhere. And that's what I want to take a look at. I want to take a look at the histology of the stomach, and we're going to see some modifications in two specific areas that we're going to talk about. There's modifications that we're going to see in the mucosa, and there's modifications that we will see in the muscularis layers. There are 4 layers, again, to the digestive system: a mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and a serosa. And the modifications that we'll see in the stomach will be found in the mucosal layer, and we're going to discuss them, and also in the muscularis layer. The submucosa is a normal submucosa. It's made up of an areolar type of connective tissue, and the serosa on the outside is the normal serosa that we would expect to find. So let's start by taking a look at the mucosa, because there's some major changes in the mucosa of the stomach. One of the things that we have on the inside of the stomach in the mucosa, and remember the mucosa is the layer that's contacting the food, is that we're going to find these structures that are called rugae. There are structures that are known as rugae. Rugae, they're visible to the naked eye if you could look in the stomach. They're also palpable. When we use the word palpable, if you're not familiar with the term palpable, it means that you can feel it with your fingers, you can palpate it. They're visible, they're palpable, and they're basically ridges, or if you want to think of them as folds. There's visible, palpable ridges and folds that we find on the inside of the stomach. The artist picture above me tries to demonstrate it on the inside, the rugae, but I'll show you cadaver dissection. This would be a stomach and a dissection taken out and opened up. We can see this in the anterior view, and these are what the rugae look like. There's all these ridges or folds on the inside of the stomach. You run your fingers over them, they don't go away. They're there. They're permanent ridges or folds. So there's something that's called rugae. So that's something that's a little bit different that we have in the mucosa. We're also going to see now that we've gone from a stratified squamous epithelium that we had in the esophagus, and we now have simple columnar epithelium. So it was stratified squamous lining the oral cavity, stratified squamous epithelium in the throat, stratified squamous epithelium in the esophagus, all for protection, wear and tear protection. God bless you. And now it changes over to a simple columnar. Simple epithelium is found in areas where we have secretion going on and absorption taking place in this area. And what happens is that this simple columnar epithelium will actually penetrate down into the lamina propria, and it forms something called gastric pits. And I'll show you a picture of that. But it penetrates into what we call the lamina propria, which is part of the mucosa, and it then forms these structures that we call gastric pits. Kind of think of, ever been somewhere, a wishing well? You know, you look down into the well, it's got the stones all along the walls of it going down. You got the cells going all down. Or if you ever looked into a manhole, you look into a manhole, you'll see the brick going down in the manhole. It looks a little bit like that as we go down into it. So what we have is something that looks like this. We take the mucosal layer over here, and it's now changed over into simple columnar epithelium, but in certain places it penetrates down and it forms these structures, and you can see at the top they're referred to as gastric pits. Under the microscope it would look like this. These are the openings into the gastric pits, and these are some of those cells that we have, and they penetrate downward, and we're going to talk about the different cells. We have the gastric pits. Well, the gastric pits themselves, those gastric pits, we're kind of getting smaller and smaller here. The gastric pits are actually lined with something that we call gastric glands. So the gastric pits, they're lined with structures called gastric glands. A lot of gastric we're using here, gastric, dealing with the stomach. So your gastric pits are lined with gastric glands, and there's actually 5 different types of gastric gland cells, and we're going to talk about them a little bit, the 5 different gastric gland cells that we have. So kind of picking that up over here, if we take a look at the gastric glands, they're made up of 5 distinct cells that we have there. There's 5 cell types that we're going to find making up the gastric glands, and I'll point them out to you, but 2 of them are mucus glands. So we have one that's referred to as a surface mucus cell, and then we have something that's referred to as a mucus neck cell. So the surface mucus cells and mucus neck cells, and as you can guess from the name mucus in here, that's what they secrete. They secrete mucus. The difference between them is just the location of them. The surface ones sit closer to the surface, to the lumen of the stomach where the food is, and the other one sits a little bit deeper. So we can take this picture here where we have the gastric pits. Well, let's blow it up just a little bit. And so here's a gastric pit leading down, and there's different cells. You can see that they're simple columnar cells that line the pits, but there are these 5 different cells. There are surface mucus cells and mucus neck cells. They're the first ones to release their secretions out. They secrete mucus, as the name would imply, so the surface cells are up on the surface and just going into the pit a bit. The mucus neck cells are a little bit deeper. So the first secretion that comes out is mucus, and we produce a lot of mucus inside the stomach, a tremendous amount. And it coats the inside of the stomach, and that's what protects it from the acids that we have there. We don't have that amount of mucus in the esophagus. That's why GERD bothers us. We don't have that amount of mucus in the small intestines. The acids will bother it there. But in the stomach, we can release the acid because we have a tremendous amount of mucus. Then we have another cell that's called a parietal cell. There are parietal cells. So you have mucus cells that are surface and neck cells, and then we have parietal cells. Why? I don't know. Before someone asked the question, I don't know. If someone wants to always know, why is there so much parietal bones, parietal layer, I have no idea. I didn't read this stuff. I had to memorize it. You ladies and gents too. But the parietal cells are the cells that actually secrete. They make hydrochloric acid. They make the hydrochloric acid, the HCl. Very, very strong acid. I mentioned the last time we were together, last Tuesday, that in the stomach it has a pH of like pH 1 to 2, very, very low acidic pH. And they also secrete something referred to as intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor, and it's kind of interesting. I know I mentioned this in Anatomy 1 in my class, but it's not something that even my own students spend a lot of time memorizing. When we were talking about blood back in chapter 19, in order to produce red blood cells, there's a specific vitamin that's very important for red blood cell production. If anybody remembers what you need. It's one of the B vitamins. B12, yeah, B12. You need vitamin B12 to make red blood cells. You need intrinsic factor to absorb B12. Intrinsic factor is necessary for vitamin B12 absorption. And what happens is, as we get older, old people, we don't make quite as much of this stuff. And you don't absorb the B12 as well as you did when you were younger, and your diet diet, and that's why sometimes, maybe with your own family, maybe your mom or dad has to take one of your grandparents once in a while to the doctor, and you go, what'd they go for? And they had to get a B12 injection. They're not absorbing it properly, so we just put it directly into the bloodstream, and then they have it available. So you do need intrinsic factor for this purpose, and if you don't have it, you're not making enough of it, or if you don't have vitamin B12 in your diet, there is a condition, it's something that's called pernicious anemia. Oops. Pernicious anemia is an anemia, it's a decreased number of red blood cells, but it's due to the fact that you're not getting enough vitamin B12 into your body to be utilized. It used to be something that was rather rare. We didn't see it much, but it's become more prevalent for a couple of reasons. One of the big reasons is that people are just living older. When I was your age, it was very unusual to have somebody in the neighborhood that was in their late 80s or even in their 90s. That was crazy. I mean, people passed away in the mid 70s or so. Now you look into obituaries, you see a lot of people 100 years old, 102 years old, 95. So they're living older, and the older you get older, things don't work as well. Trust me. I used to be able to fly up. 35 years ago, I could fly up 2 stairs to the 3rd floor, no problem. And I used to have some older colleagues who've since retired and stuff, and I used to wonder, they can't get up there now. Your legs don't want to do it anymore. It catches up with you. So people living older. The other thing is we've also had people getting bariatric surgeries, gastric bypass surgeries, or weight problems and such. If the food bypasses the stomach, it's not going to mix in with this stuff. So even if there is B12 in your diet, you're not going to absorb it, which causes problems. And then the third thing is that we do have a number of people, more and more people looking at becoming vegetarians and vegans, and they don't even eat any dairy or eggs or fish. They don't eat any of that at all. And there's no vitamin B12 in any sort of fruit or vegetable. You're not going to get it. You have to absolutely supplement it. So we're seeing a more and more pernicious anemia taking place. But that's what's secreted by the parietal cells. There's a fourth cell called simply a chief cell. The chief cells are responsible for secreting 2 things. Chief cells produce something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen and another secretion, small amounts of something called gastric lipase. They're both digestive enzymes. So the chief cells produce digestive enzymes that we have there. So these are 4 of the 5 cells. Surface mucus cells, mucous neck cells, we have the parietal cells and the chief cells. And collectively, what they're producing and secreting out is going to travel up the gastric pit and go into the stomach lumen. All of these together, this is actually what we refer to as a gastric juice. When we talk about gastric juice, the stuff that's in the stomach, the stuff that's mixing with the food, it's made up of these secretions. You have the mucus, you're going to have the hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, pepsinogen, and the gastric lipase. Collectively, these all are making gastric juice. But there is a 5th cell. There is one other cell that we have. And the 5th cell, it's just a letter, alphabet letter. It's just simply they're referred to as G cells. That's our 5th point. It's just called G cells, the 5th cell. We're very, very low down the bottom of the gastric pits. I'm pointing all these out. And what they do is they secrete a hormone. They secrete a hormone, and the name of the hormone is called gastrin. It gets redundant. Gastric pits, gastric glands, gastric cells, gastrin. I apologize. Gastrin. Now, gastrin's a hormone, so it doesn't go into the food. All of these go into the stomach. They will, and this all enters into the stomach. Lumen is going to mix with the food. This is a hormone. Back in Anatomy 1 in Chapter 4, when you learned a little bit about exocrine versus endocrine glands. Endocrine glands release their secretions into the bloodstream. So this stuff's going into the bloodstream, this gastrin. It's a hormone. And it has 4 rather interesting effects. That gastrin, as the levels come up, we just don't dump out a ton of gastrin. It has to slowly increase the gastrin levels in the bloodstream. But as the levels begin to go up, there's 4 different effects that it has. One of the effects is that as the gastrin levels get higher and higher, will constrict the lower esophageal sphincter. As those levels come up, as you're producing more and more gastric juice over here into the stomach, as the gastrin levels in the blood go up, they're gonna cause the lower esophageal sphincter to contract so that you don't splash the gastric juice up into the esophagus. We don't wanna have GERD. So we have it doing that. The second thing that it's going to do is it's going to increase gastric juice secretion. So you're going to make more mucus, more hydrochloric acid, more intrinsic factor. It'll increase the gastric juice secretions as the gastrin levels come up. The third thing that it's going to do is it's going to increase stomach motility. It's going to make your stomach churn more. We're going to churn and we're going to mix the food with the gastric juice. And then the fourth thing that will happen when gastrin reaches maximal amounts is now it's going to relax the pyloric sphincter, the sphincter on the other end, so that the food can now leave the stomach. You see, digestion itself is under both nervous system and endocrine control. The nervous system is certainly aware of what's going on. You eat a meal, you had breakfast this morning, the food got into your stomach. As the stomach stretched, well, it sends information on cranial nerve number 10 up to the brain. Brain says, oh, her stomach stretched, but his stomach stretched. Must have ate something, sends a message back down to tell us to begin to secrete gastric juice and to have motility go on and to close the sphincters and relax others. That's the nervous system, but at the same time we have a backup over here with the endocrine system. This is endocrine in nature over here. So we have both a nervous system and an endocrine control to our digestion. That's all I'm saying. So these are the things that are modified in the mucosal layer of the stomach. And then we have one other modification that we see in the muscularis area, excuse me, of the stomach. The first day that we were together when I discussed the 4 different layers and I mentioned the muscularis, I said the muscularis is made up of smooth muscle. There's 2 layers. There's an inner or a deep sheet that runs circularly, and there's an outer one that runs longitudinally. Well, the stomach a little bit different. In the stomach, we're actually going to find 3 sheets of muscle or 3 layers. There's 3 sheets or 3 layers of muscle that we have here. The inner one, the deep one, the inner one now doesn't run circularly. The inner one now runs in an oblique pattern. So it runs on an angle. You have a middle layer now, and the middle layer is the layer that runs in a circular pattern. And then lastly, we have the outer layer, the more superficial layer, and that's still running longitudinally. Yes?
So the esophagus only has 2 layers, the stomach has 2
It is,
layers.
esophagus has 2 layers, the small intestine has 2 layers, the large intestine has just a circular longitudinal, correct. And this one they add an extra one in. And what this does, by adding this extra layer in, you're gonna get better mixing or churning. We're gonna get better mixing taking place here. Not only are you kind of picture, not only are you contracting the stomach this way, in this direction, and say this way, but we're also contracting it on an angle. So you get a lot better mixing in the stomach at that time. So that's the modifications that we see specific to the stomach. Now the food has entered the stomach. You'll remember we referred to it as a bolus. It gets into the stomach as a bolus. But we're going to see some changes take place. So let's talk about the digestion itself that takes place in the stomach. First, we have mechanical digestion. Just like in the mouth, you have mechanical chemical. In the mouth, we had mastication or chewing in the mouth, and you had then the initiation of starch digestion in the mouth. Well, now we're going to have mechanical chemical in the stomach. The mechanical digestion that takes place in the stomach is something that's called maceration. Maceration. Maceration is actually a combination of both peristalsis that takes place, normal peristalsis that occurs, pushing the food along, plus we have what I mentioned over there, you have these mixing waves. So if we take the peristalsis plus the mixing waves, we get maceration. I like to think of maceration, you think of it more of just grinding. Just really grinding the food apart at this point. The food went into your stomach as a bolus. You chewed the food, you had the little ball, you mixed it around, you swallowed it, and we start off with the bolus. By the time the stomach's done with it, we end up with something that's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Chyme's like a white pasty material.
That's on the HESI.
That's on the HESI. I had a student yesterday said she's studying for it, and she said everything that I've been covering, she said it's in the review word for word. That's why I'm gonna get you all prepared for it. And by the way, I'm just gonna mention that next Tuesday and next Wednesday with lab, I'm gonna go over some histology and stuff. It's boring as anything. I'm actually gonna go over the genetics early. I'm gonna do that genetics part early. This way you have it. So if you're taking those tests in February, so I wanna get them out of the way because it's already the end of January. Some of you may have tests later in third week of February and into March, so we'll get that out of the way. But the bolus. So we go from a bolus, we go into chyme. It looks like a thick breakfast cereal, like an oatmeal-y but white kind of cereal like that. It's very, very thick. We've broken it down. Now, anytime you deal with mechanical digestion, think of physically, what we're doing to the food physically. We're breaking it down more and more. On the chemical level, there's a couple things going on chemically. On the chemical level, we're going to be breaking chemical bonds, obviously, but a couple things take place. One of the things that takes place has nothing to do really with digestion per se, but I mentioned here is that due to the fact that we have a low pH, due to that very, very low pH because of the acid, a pH 1 to 2, what we'll do is we will actually denature or break down the salivary amylase. So the salivary amylase, which started starch digestion in the mouth, and it continued to work in the throat, it continued to work in the esophagus, it continues to even work in the cardia area and a little bit of the fundus. But as it gets down toward the body of the stomach where the pH is very, very low, that low pH, remember, low pH is acidic, it's an acid pH. Basically the acids denature, or think of it as destroy, the salivary amylase. So basically what I'm saying is we're stopping carbohydrate digestion. We stop it temporarily in the stomach because that's not the main digestion. The major digestion that takes place in the stomach, the one that, and I think even on the review sheet there's a question, what's the main digestion in the stomach? The main digestion in the stomach is the digestion of proteins. We digest proteins in the stomach, and the way the proteins get broken down is the proteins get acted upon by an enzyme called pepsin, and what that does is it begins to cut the protein apart. And we know that the building blocks of proteins are amino acids, so you'll liberate out some amino acids, unless we were living in England, we would liberate out those amino acids. They have amino acids. It sounds better, I don't know. And then sometimes we'll get two of these that are still hooked together, so we get some things called dipeptides. Those are two amino acids hooked together. There's tripeptides, three amino acids hooked together. And there's still some that are four or more, which we refer to as polypeptides. Poly just means many. We cut it apart. If you had a somewhat decent childhood, maybe you saw a Tom and Jerry cartoon when you were a kid, and the mouse stole the big long chain of hot dogs that were all hooked together. That's a protein. It's a big long chain of hot dogs, and each little hot dog is an amino acid. So sometimes you'll snip off one of the hot dogs, we get an amino acid. Sometimes you only clip off two of them. They're still hooked together with three or more. But we begin to break it down. And the interesting thing here is that we're using this enzyme pepsin. Well, back when I discussed the gastric gland cells, under the chief cells, I mentioned something called pepsinogen. You have pepsinogen. Pepsinogen, which is what's produced by the chief cells, pepsinogen is inactive. It's not a functioning protein. the digestive enzyme. However, when we add hydrochloric acid to it, it now becomes pepsin, which is the activated form. This is an active form over here. And the reason for that is pepsin digests proteins. Your stomach wall is a protein. You couldn't store something in a container that it would eat through the container. Imagine that, taking a glass, one of these bottles, you had one of the bottles your water's in, and you're putting something in it that can eat through plastic. You can't do it. So we have it released from the chief cells as pepsinogen, which is an inactive protein, enzyme. We get it catalyzed by hydrochloric acid and it becomes pepsin. Your face.
Why does Advil cause ulcers in the stomach?
All of them do. There's side effects, Advil, Tylenol, even aspirin itself, they all cause bleeding of the stomach lining. They irritate the inside of the stomach lining. It's just, I don't know exactly the chemistry behind it, but yeah, even if you take just a regular aspirin, you get a little bit of bleeding in there. People that use a lot of aspirin or they use a lot of Advils or Tylenols and stuff, they can actually get quite a bit of bleeding and they actually lose blood. I mean, their blood count can drop, and it's just something to be aware of. There's no medication, there is no prescription med that doesn't have side effects. We make them sound like they're all safe and effective, but they're not. They're not safe and effective. You know, Grandma was safe and effective. You didn't feel well, she made chicken soup. That was safe and effective with no side effect other than the fact it tastes good. You might want to have 3 or 4 bowls rather than 1 bowl of it. So this is the major digestion that's going on in the stomach. So on the review sheet, when it asks that, or on the test, what's the main type of digestion taking place in the stomach? It's a protein digestion, but there's a little bit of other digestion, just a small amount. In the stomach, we also can digest the butterfat molecules. Butterfat molecules that you'd find in things like a whole milk. We can digest it a little bit, the gastric lipase. We make gastric lipase, and that lipase, that L-I-P-A-S-E, they're like lipids. We can digest it down a little bit, but it's not a major digestion. It's a small digestion, the butterfat molecules that we find in whole milk. The real big digestion is this. This is the main one. The protein digestion is the big one. Now, things vary. Obviously, we're all adults in here. When you were a newborn, when we were newborns, we actually had another chemical in our stomach called renin. R-E-N-N-I-N. Some of you may sound familiar. It's used when they make cheeses. What renin does is renin actually causes either breast milk or formula. I mean, they're liquids, but in the stomach they become almost like a cottage cheese consistency, so that you have opportunity to give the pepsin a chance to digest it. Otherwise, it would be a liquid. It would just pass through the stomach too fast. So it doesn't curdle it. I don't use the word curdle. That sounds terrible, something curdling in your stomach. It makes it like a cottage cheese consistency so that you can digest it. Obviously, there's a bit of a difference. With the breast milk, it's broken down rather quickly. It's made perfectly formulated. Formula takes a little bit longer to break down in there. So when you feed a baby formula, they usually stay satisfied a little bit longer. It's not as good as the breast milk. With the breast milk, poor mom's like feeding a baby every 2 hours or so. The kid's whining or we want some food. But it's perfect. And what's interesting with breast milk is that if you were to take a sample of breast milk the first day that the baby's born, has high colostrum levels in it, very good for the baby. Then it changes a bit, and you have a different chemical constitution to it. You get a month or 2 into having the baby, feeding it, it's changed again. It almost, the woman's body changes the chemistry of the breast milk for the baby's needs at the time, which is kind of interesting. And the proteins are very, very easy to absorb in that breast milk and break down. So this is what's going on mechanically and chemically in the stomach. Overall, the food in the stomach, it's not an area with a lot of absorption taking place. If we talk about absorption occurring in the stomach, with absorption, we don't absorb a lot there. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to digest proteins. We can absorb water in the stomach. That's why you can quench your thirst rather quickly. You're thirsty, I get dry here, drink some water and it satisfies you and such. Along with that, you can also absorb salts or electrolytes if you want to be fancy. Electrolytes. We have electrolytes, all those sports drink crap that they sell out there. That's the idea behind it is I'll drink the sports drink and I can use it that's just a personal opinion, it's not a science thing, but to me, we're all a waste of money, all the sports drinks, unless you're an elite athlete really pushing it. I mean, what do I need, a pre-workout drink, a mid-workout drink, a post-workout drink, a recovery drink with the artificial colors in it and everything else, that's all right. The world will survive underwater and some things. Also, not all, but some drugs. Some drugs will be absorbed. We were just talking about Tylenol and ibuprofen, about aspirin, things like that. They get absorbed in the stomach. Others are actually enteric-coated so that they pass through the stomach to get into the small intestine and be absorbed later on. But there are some that we absorb there. And the last one, which I know my college students absolutely know nothing about, they're nice college students here, would be alcohol. Alcohol gets absorbed through the stomach lining. That's why you're often told don't drink on an empty stomach. Drink on an empty stomach, it's going to get absorbed a lot faster. If you're eating something, at least it gets into the food, it gets carried into the small intestine and gets absorbed a bit later on. The food in the stomach will stay there on average for maybe 2 to 4 hours. So it can take 2 to 4 hours for the stomach to do its job and empty out. If you were to eat a carbohydrate-rich meal, so if it was a carbohydrate-rich meal that you ate, that would be more at the 2-hour end. And if you ate a meal that was more rich in fats, if it was a fat-rich meal, that would be more at the 4-hour level. It would take, since most people eat what I would call a somewhat balanced diet, you eat some carbs, some proteins, some fats in there, you're probably closer to maybe like 3 to 4 hours. I think that's another one on the review sheet. It asks, which ones carbs come out the fastest. Now that doesn't mean that if you eat a meal and it has some carbs, protein, and fats, that all of a sudden your stomach lets all the carbs out first, and then it'll let the proteins out later. It's just overall. If you were to eat, just a big bowl of cereal in the morning with some milk in it, you're really looking at basically a carb meal. You'll feel kind of stuffed for 10 minutes, and then by the time you drive away, you're starting to feel hungry again. It's breaking apart rather quickly, and you're going to get it out of the stomach fast, which also tells you that as North Americans, all of us, a lot of what we eat and why we eat is really psychological. I mean, if your family eats a meal, you sit down at 6 o'clock at night and you finish by 7 and you're cleaning up the dishes, and then you go in to watch a college basketball game or something, 9 o'clock, and you say, you gotta go back and get some Doritos out of the cupboard or something. Your stomach won't be, you finished at 7 o'clock, your stomach won't be empty till about 11, but you go, it's psychological, you don't need it, you're going back, because you're watching the guy stand there, those funny guys with Wendy's, they got the burger on, they got a big pretzel bun now, or they got a double baconated cheeseburger, you're getting hungry. Or they come in with, they see the nachos, and you don't need to eat, we just, psychologically, we eat for wrong reasons. I know that many of you will probably, by the time you finish your healthcare career, if I bump into you, say, hey, it's just what you said, I put on like 20 pounds, 25 pounds. You're sitting around studying all the time, you're not doing what you normally do, and as you sit around the house studying, what you normally end up doing is go in and raid the refrigerator. I remember doing it myself during the stupid COVID nonsense that we went through, teaching at home. I teach a class for an hour and a half on Zoom, and then I'd say, okay, I got 20 minutes. I go into the kitchen, see what's in the refrigerator. My wife would always look at me, she goes, are you looking for something, or are you defrosting it? And I'm looking for something, I don't know. So the stomach, a little bit about the stomach. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Let's take a look at some of these pictures, flip off the lights for a second. So we talked about this here. You can see what a gastric pit looks like, the opening to the pits. And again, those surface and mucous neck cells are closer to the lumen, as it would be where the food is, because we do want to get a nice thick coat of mucus on the inside of the stomach to protect it from the acids. Here's our parietal cells, and they're not color-coded in real life. They secrete hydrochloric acid and that intrinsic factor, very, very important for B12 absorption. Vitamin B12 is kind of interesting. If you take B12, it's water soluble. You don't need a lot of B12, but it's important for making red blood cells, very important for the nervous system also. It's kind of interesting. Most of the time, even if you take a multiple vitamin, you'll see B12, but it's in the form of something called cyanocobalamin. And the cyano actually deals with cyanide. It's actually small amount, part of it. There's something that's a little bit better, it's called methylcobalamin. You can get it right in the health food store, they're not that expensive. They're sublingual, you put it under your tongue and it dissolves and it just gets absorbed through blood vessels under your tongue. And then you don't have to deal with the cyano portion of it, but anyhow. Let's go a little bigger. The chief cells that we have here, they make pepsinogen, which is the inactive protein digestive enzyme. We have to activate it. And it also makes small amount, not a lot, small amounts of gastric lipase. So you have a little bit of dairy, whole milk dairy in your diet. Maybe somebody had some cottage cheese this morning, or you had a yogurt, you like a yogurt or something, you'll get a little bit of digestion. The major fat digestion's in the small intestine. All of these are being produced, go into the lumen here through the gastric glands, out the gastric pit, into the lumen of the stomach. That's what I had on the board I erased. I said this is all gastric juice. The G cells, the one at the bottom, the G cells secrete a hormone. Hormones go into the bloodstream, and that's just a secondary mechanism for controlling digestion in the stomach. I mean, digestion in the stomach is kind of interesting. There's actually different phases to it. We have a phase that it's not for testing, but we have what's called a cephalic phase, gastric phase, and an intestinal phase. The word cephalic is when I was in college back in the 70s. We didn't have superior and inferior. We had cephalad and caudal, we referred to it. And cephalad dealt with toward the head. There's a cephalic phase, which actually gets the stomach kind of ready for the food, the thought of food, the smell of food, the sight of food, cooking. Those type of things get it going. And it's kind of lost in North America. You travel, I got students from all around the world here. Most cultures, the kitchen is kind of the center of the house. I mean, people are into cooking, you go there, you're chatting, this is where everything takes place. You're seeing it's cooked, grandpa comes by and sticks his finger in the pot, gets just a little taste, gets the stomach ready. You have no food in your stomach yet, but it's getting it ready. Nowadays in the United States, North America, the kitchen is the place where you put $100,000 in to renovate it so you can show your neighbors what you have, but there's nothing ever cooked there. You go, you got a Sub-Zero, but there's nothing in it. I mean, what's going on here? And then you have a gastric phase. That's when the food actually gets into the stomach, so it really gets working. And then when it's ready to empty out in that 2 to 4 hour range, we get what's called an intestinal phase, which kind of slows the stomach down just a little bit to allow it to empty slowly. We can take a lot of food in rather quickly, but when it empties, you only empty your stomach about a tablespoon at a time. So as it contracts, about a tablespoon squeezes out, and then it relaxes, then it contracts again, about a tablespoon comes out. And that's because it's so acidic that we have to neutralize the acids in the small intestine, otherwise we're going to damage it. So that's a little bit about the stomach here. We had the photomicrographs looking down into the gastric pits themselves, kind of interesting. So we're going to take a look now at something else. We're going to take a look now at some accessory structures. The food leaves the stomach now, 2 to 4 hours, whatever we happen to be eating, and it's going to enter into the small intestine. And the first part of it is this curve here. So they've resected the stomach out because what we're going to take a look at now are these accessory structures, the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. We'll take a look at these. So this they're saying, where's the stomach? They cut it out so we could see everything else over here. Oh, by the way, just as an aside, again, students always wear testing, no, not the testing. Forensically, they use this. They check stomach contents.
Oh,
Yeah, they have to check the stomach contents on an individual. There's been cases in the United States. There was one I remember from years back, but kind of interesting. A man reported his wife missing, said she left in the evening to go to work. She worked an evening shift at a hospital. We had dinner that night. She left, and she didn't report there, and she never came home. And so, police started looking for her, and they find her car, and they find her body in the trunk of the car. She's dead. She's been killed. It happened in Buffalo, New York, in the winter. Kind of cold up in Buffalo, New York, if you've been looking at it there. Obviously, if you're even an amateur sleuth, when you hear a story about something like that, your first primary suspect is, so he had a good old husband. So they do the autopsy on her, a forensic autopsy on her, and when they open up her stomach, they find in her stomach some contents to it, and they happen to ask the husband about, what were you eating? Well, we were having this and this, and we had the French fries. Well, what kind? The crinkle cut French fries and everything. She still had crinkle cut French fries in her stomach. I mean, French fries in the stomach would become mush in a couple of minutes. I mean, she was killed at the dinner table. I mean, this poor woman. I mean, that's what he got caught on. He got caught on by what they had for dinner and what was still in her stomach. So when you watch some of these shows on television, and with CSI or this and that, there's some truth behind these things that they do. There's certain things that they'll check. There's certain bugs that will get into the skin, and we're talking about maggots and things going in certain time frames. It's very scientific, all of that. So we're going to talk about some of these accessory structures. So the food now has left the stomach, and it's going to begin to enter into the small intestine. And as it enters into the small intestine, we have three accessory structures there. I don't think we're going to get through all three of them, but we'll start to take a look at some of these. One of the accessory structures that we see here is the pancreas. And the reason they've resected the stomach out is because the pancreas actually sits posterior to the greater curvature of the stomach, so you wouldn't normally see it. It's posterior to the greater curvature, so you have to lift the stomach up. And so that's why they've resected it out in this picture so that we can see it there. It's not a big structure. I know some of you will go on to healthcare fields where you are going to do human cadaver dissections. Some of you won't. But if you know anybody that is in a program like that, they're in med school or dental school or any of those, chiropractic, osteopathic, PT, OT programs, anything like that, podiatric even, if they can have a visitor come by and you can go by, take a look, it's kind of interesting. We picture everything to be so big in the body, it's really not. The pancreas is only about 5, maybe at the most 6 inches in length. It's not really big. So it's 5 to 6 inches in length and about 1 inch in diameter. It's not an overly big structure, the pancreas. And the pancreas itself, there's 3 different parts to it. It has 2 ducts that drain it. We have that curve of the small intestine that comes like this. It curves like this and curves back this way. And then the pancreas sits tucked in here. And when we look at it, it has 3 different areas to it. It has a head that's closest to the small intestine. There's a body area, and then way out the end over here is something that we call the tail. So it has a head, a body, and a tail, 3 different parts to it anatomically. In addition, it has 2 ducts that drain this. Let me get some of these colored markers here. Running through the pancreas, a big one that runs through the inside of the pancreas, is a duct that runs through the inside of the pancreas, and it's a lousy picture. We'll look at the one on the board in a second. And then eventually makes its way into the small intestine. And this duct here is something that's referred to as the pancreatic duct. It also has a little side duct that comes off of this. And the little side duct comes up and also enters in, and that's just simply referred to as the accessory duct of the pancreas. So there's these 2 ducts that we have here that are going to allow the pancreatic juice to exit. The big guy, the pancreatic duct, the big one, this one actually meets up with another duct. There's another duct over here, I'm going to put it in green. This is called the common bile duct, which we'll talk about when we get to the liver. The common bile duct is releasing bile down, and the pancreatic, this looks like a horrible road map there, absolutely. You can understand that picture. I don't know, we're gonna have your head examined. The picture on the board's a little bit better. Here's our pancreas over here in the tan. The larger area is the head, the middle area is the body, and there's distal portions, the tail. You can see reflected to the surface the large pancreatic duct running through inside, and then the smaller one off the side, the accessory duct. But if I blow this up, this is where the pancreatic duct joins with the common bile duct in green. They meet up over in this area. So both bile and pancreatic juice get into the small intestine in the same area. So here's your pancreatic duct over here. Here's your common bile duct. They meet and then dump into the small intestine. And again, back to this picture, you can see the pancreatic duct, and here's your common bile duct over here meeting up. You have this extra duct. There are older names. I ain't using them. Nobody uses them anymore. You can see with the pancreatic duct, the old name was the duct of Wersen. I mean, whoops, get back here. The duct of Wersen. That wouldn't tell you anything if you heard that name. The duct of Wersen doesn't give you, and this is even better over here. This is the duct of Santorini years ago. Those are the names that I have. Duct of Santorini. I'm looking for a canal in Venice or something. I mean, I'm looking at a map in Italy. At least you know if you say accessory duct of the pancreas. Well, okay, I got an idea where it is if you hear pancreatic duct. The pancreas is also rather interesting in that the pancreas is actually what's referred to as a heterocrine gland. It's a heterocrine gland, the pancreas. A heterocrine gland is a gland that's both exocrine and endocrine. It has both functions. It's not just endocrine and it's not just exocrine. It's exocrine and it's endocrine together. So it's a combination of them. And the pancreas is one of these unique structures of our heterocrine glands that we have in our body. But though they're heterocrine glands, it's not equally distributed, the exocrine endocrine portion of it. The endocrine portion only makes up about 1% of the pancreas. So only about 1% of the pancreas is endocrine in nature. And the cells that make this up, the cells that make up this endocrine portion of it, are what we refer to as pancreatic islets. They're called pancreatic islets. They also had an older name years ago. They were referred to as the islets of Langerhans. Those I'd be looking for islands off the coast of Ireland somewhere. Pancreatic islets make a little more sense. So in the pancreatic islets, and what these do is obviously this is hormone producing. So when you think about insulin, when you deal with someone that's a diabetic, having diabetic issues, type 1, type 2, pancreatic issues, the pancreas produces another hormone called glucagon. And we'll be looking at all of these. I should put that over here. We'll discuss all of this in chapter 18, end of the semester, when we're dealing with the endocrine system. They produce another hormone referred to as somatostatin, and the fourth hormone that's referred to as pancreatic polypeptide. It's a protein-based hormone. So we're not really going to discuss that here. I'm just mentioning in passing. We want to focus on the other 99%. This is endocrine. This is going to be something we'll discuss in chapter 18. The other 99% of the pancreas is the exocrine portion. That's the exocrine portion of it. The cells that form this are referred to as acinard cells, or sometimes we just refer to them as acini cells, acinard cells or acini cells. The name acinard, a lot of times they were just named by what it looks like. Acinard cells are cells that have sort of a flask-like shape to them, and so we call them acinard cells.